All right, guys, let's get back to the presentation here. Just posted the first video for you, and I'll give you the layout of everything we need to get done here once I finish with all these presentations. So, talking about rising wages for industrial workers and the fact that the income disparity continues to grow. And then we get to September 1929. It's at this point that the stock market continues to rise. You can see the vast growth of stock prices here on the right-hand side, and how it is just unreal. The amount of increase between 1923 and 1929. So imagine this is like going up the roller coaster. You're getting to the very tippy point of the roller coaster, and then in 1929 we kind of get to that peak, and then we fall off. That's kind of the perfect image for you to have in your mind when it comes to 1929. So many people are borrowing money to buy stocks. They assume the prices are going to continue to go up. And by the end of the decade, 80% of radios, 60% of cars, these are all purchased on credit. They're all purchased on installment plans. Versus 10 years ago, many people were buying these with straight cash. So it proves by 1929 that so many people in the United States are living outside of their means, and that can only work for so long. You can't live outside of your means for 20, 30, 40 years. It'll eventually catch up to you. You might be able to do it for a few years, but this sets up the recipe for what becomes the stock market crash in October of 1929. So on the 29th of October, that is really where the whole thing kind of falls out. But you need to actually go back to September of 1929, kind of where we just were. On the stock market towards the end of September 1929, kind of started to sputter a little bit. But a lot of the rich people like JP Morgan, they bought more stocks to kind of help stabilize, and it worked for a little while. By the beginning of October, stock prices began to kind of fall. And then on October 23rd, confidence in the market was completely lost. Just as one example, the Dow, which is one of the leading factors in the stock market, it dropped 21 points in an hour. That's not good. So the rest of the day, which is known as Black Thursday, October 23rd, Black Thursday, roughly 9 million shares were sold. 9 million stocks were sold on Black Thursday. And that was the worst day in the stock market history at this point. And people were hoping, okay, that was it. Let's get back. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. Some investors started to kind of pull their money out. They were nervous about what was going on with the stock market. They didn't really want to sit there and wait it out. And then on October 29th, the stock market went into a free fall. 16 million shares were sold on this day. So you had 9 million on Black Thursday, October 23rd, 16 million sold on what is Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday is the most famous day when you're talking about the Great Depression and the stock market crash. When people talk about the stock market crash, it's usually they're referring to Black Tuesday, but Black Thursday is really where things started to show evidence that something was going on. So 16 million shares equates to about couple billion dollars lost in just a few hours. Many people who had bought stocks on margin, meaning they were buying stocks essentially on credit, they lost everything. And there were plenty of people who didn't buy on margin who lost everything as well, because all of their wealth had been put into the stock market because the stock market was doing so well. This is a scene in New York City of people running to the banks, lines outside of banks. There's a bank over here, and then there's a bank over here as well. And people are lined up outside of these banks to try to get their money. The bottom had fallen out. They wanted to ensure that they had something. But the problem is banks didn't keep a whole lot of money on reserves, and there is no such thing as the national reserve at this point, meaning money that was stocked up in the nation's capital. And so if you were the 101st person in line and the bank ran out of money on the 100th person, everybody after that 100th person literally had nothing. They didn't divide up money and say, oh, I need to give money to this person, so you can't have all of your money. If you were in line, you got the money. When the bank ran out of money, that was it. And so that's how a lot of people lost a substantial amount of money. And those that did lose everything, you have scenes like this, where this gentleman who lost everything on the stock market is standing on a busy street attempting to sell his car to somebody who has money, so that way he can at least eat a meal. So the Great Crash, as it's called, was the hallmark of the nation's business cycle. And I mentioned the business cycle before. And the economy periodically grows and then it contracts. And that's just a natural process. Back in 2008, things obviously were contributed a little bit more to people than it is the natural business cycle, because banks were giving loans to people who, or mortgages to people who couldn't afford them. But the different scenarios here, in the sense that there was a multitude of factors that led to the Great Crash and the Great Depression. So, in growth periods, workers are hired, wages rise, and demand for products increases. During contraction periods, workers are fired, wages are dropped, and demand for products falls. We're right now in the expansion period. So let me pull this up for you. We're in the expansion period right now. Our economy is doing well. The economy is growing. People are buying homes. Businesses are building or expanding. Eventually, though, next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, somewhere in there, we'll reach our peak. Now, what happened in 2008 is we had a drastic contraction, and we fell. This is basically where the Great Depression is. In 2008, I'd say maybe we got to right about here. The hopes is that when you have a contraction, it's nothing major. You have a little bit of fall off and then you come back up. You have a little bit of fall off and you come back up. It's moments like this where a lot of people lose jobs, businesses aren't doing well, and so forth. So this is something you need to put into your notes. This business cycle here, very important to kind of understand the expansion, peak, contraction, and trough of the business cycle to really truly grasp the complexities of the Great Depression. So if you need to pause the video, go ahead and pause the video, but make sure this gets into your notes. So the banking system is going to feel the effects of the crash first, because people feared that their money was going to be lost. They ran to the bank. They attempted to withdraw the funds. This is what we call bank runs. Bank runs. Banks didn't have enough money on hand as cash, and so a lot of these bank runs will cause banks to fail. So I'm going to give you some numbers here. In 1929, so the year the crash occurred, there were 641 banks that failed. 641 banks. By 1930, 1 year later, 1,350 banks, 1,350 banks failed. It means they couldn't open their doors anymore. They didn't have any money. And then by 1933, we're getting into the presidency of FDR. At this point, almost 4,000 banks had closed. Now, part of that is going to be government regulated, but a good portion of that is simply because the banks did not have any money. They literally could not open their doors because there wasn't even a dollar in the bank. So um, when that happens, you got no choice but to close. Now, when I mentioned just a second ago about how some of the bank closures were going to be government regulated, we'll talk more about that when we get into the presidency of FDR. Um, the reason things get worse is not because the banks closed, but business leaders believed that the survival of their companies depended on production cutbacks to maintain price levels and layoffs to reduce payroll. So when you eliminate people from the workforce, though they're not making any money, they don't have any money in the bank, that is really when it becomes the Great Depression. When a vast majority of the population, especially outside of those rich white guys who are at the top of the food chain, that's when the disparity between rich and poor becomes even more, and the effects of the Great Depression are felt even more by the people in the lower class. So factories close, workers are laid off. This lowered the demand for goods. By 1933, the unemployment rate reached 25%. That's 1 out of every 4 people, and that's modest. Because it doesn't really tell the whole story. Just because you had a job did not mean that you were making enough to really live off of. So 25% just didn't have a job, period. But another 30-40% had a job, but really couldn't make ends meet. They were still having to rely on soup kitchens and stuff like that. Um, to give you an idea, even Henry Ford during the Depression had to shut down factories, and he had to lay off roughly 75,000 employees. So the person who provided more income from the get-go, provided the weekend, and really treated his employees well, he took the hit. Because you think about it, most business people are in business to make money. So when the economy goes down, they're not going to take the hit. They're going to lay off people or find other means to continue making the, or at least attempt to make the amount of money they made prior to. So here are some signs that you see during the 1930s. Why can't you give my dad a job? Ragged's kid doesn't starve. Why should we? Parents use kids as an important tool to encourage people in the business sector to provide jobs. They were sitting pretty. A lot of them were still sitting pretty even during the Great Depression, but it was the common person that suffered the most. And you have something called hobos, people who travel from town to town attempting to find jobs. But this sign says it all. In one of the towns in the Midwest, jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own. And that was a sign put on by the Chamber of Commerce. So there was the impacts of the Depression were felt nationwide. It wasn't one particular region. It wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't even just in the United States, and we'll get into how it becomes a global depression a little bit later. So, Congress, in an attempt to increase the amount of money in the United States by protecting American manufacturers, they passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Circle it, underline it, highlight it, do whatever you need to do. It's passed in 1930. It was Herbert Hoover's attempt to solve the problem. But this strategy was a drastic disaster. I believe that the number was 57.1% was the tax, the tariff that they wanted to put on American, on foreign goods to protect American manufacturers. Huge mistake. 57.1%. I'm not sure why they came to the conclusion of 0.1%, but 57% is astronomical. You think about the sales tax in South Carolina, it's a little bit more than 6%. and some people don't like paying that. So the idea was to, actually, I'm running out of time here. I'm going to stop right here.